everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today I'm going to be talking about the Booktube Prize, and this is going to be my vlog all about judging the Octafinals. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and this year, for something new to do, I decided to apply to judge the Booktube Prize. If you're not familiar with the Booktube Prize, basically this year there are 3 categories. There is non-fiction, translated fiction and fiction. And we've just recently had the announcement of the long list of this. So at the beginning of January, all of the Booktube judges are sent a list, or more than one list if they have elected to vote in more than one category. I voted in the fiction category, and this is my now very messy list of all the books that were eligible for voting. On this list there were actually 0 books that I had read. I had to choose 20 to go through to the next stage. So in choosing my 20, in brief, I looked up every single one of these books on the list, read synopsises of them, and really my only criteria for it was, would I want to read the book? So if I didn't want to read the book, it immediately went on to the no list. And by the end of it, I had enough on the definite list that I only had to pick a few of the maybes. So I went back through them again and read up a bit more about them, and ended up with my list of 20. This week we've had the announcement of the 48 books that are in the Octafinals for each category. So the 48 books are now grouped into groups of 6. For fiction, I'm going to be judging Group H. Of the 20 books that I voted for, 11 of my votes did get onto that long list of 48. I got Group H, and in Group H there were no books that I had actually voted for, and actually I'm quite excited to read books that I wouldn't normally read. So there's one book out of the 6 that I was thinking I probably would read, but the rest of the 6 I don't really know anything about yet. What happens next is that we have March and April to read our 6 books and put in our votes. So what we have to do is rank our books 1 to 6, number 1 being our favourite and number 6 being our least favourite, and 3 books out of the 6 will go through for each round. So in my category I have Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohamed, How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbue, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., China Room by Sunjeev Sahota, and The Promise by Damon Galgut. Anyway, this is going to be my vlog, which will come out at the beginning of April, telling you all about my experiences of judging the Octafinals of the Booktube Prize. So before I got started on reading any of the books, I thought it would be fun to give them a bit of a ranking of how much I would like to read them. So I've ranked them 1 to 6. The book that I am probably least interested in reading out of all of them, even though I've heard good things about the author, is How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbue. It's just not a book that I ever would have picked up based on the blurb. Probably number 5 will be The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. Again, this just isn't a book that on the basis of the blurb alone would appeal to me. Probably in number 4 would be China Room. The content just doesn't sound like a book that I would read, and I'm actually really glad that these don't sound like books that I would read, because it puts this group on quite a level playing field with me, because none of them are within my comfort zone of books that I would read. Yes, there's some I want to read slightly more than others, but yeah, we will have to see where these end up, and I'm really hoping that they surprise me in a really good way and I end up with some new favourite books or favourite authors. Next up, these were predictions I made before I read it. I think The Promise would probably likely be in at number 3. Again, it doesn't sound like a book I would pick up on the basis of the blurb, but I would probably be a little bit more likely to pick it up than the other 3. The book I'm probably almost most interested in reading is The Fortune Men by Nadifa Mohamed. This is the one in the group that sounds most similar to other books I've found interesting, so it has some themes that I like, such as crime, and I think there might even be murder involved. I'm hoping that that will be a good one. And the number one will have to be the only one that I probably thought I would read before the prize. That's Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr. When I read the synopsises for these in order to vote for the long list, I came very, very close to choosing Cloud Cuckoo Land, and of all of the books on the very long list, it was the one that possibly intrigued me the most, and it made me feel very drawn to it. So I believe it's got 3 different timelines, and I think the 3 timelines sound very out there and very interesting. But it could go either way for me because it is a really, really large book of over 600 pages. If I don't like the style of it, I can see myself really struggling with that one. We do have to read all 6 of the books, and we do have to finish them all. Yeah, good boy. You're going to be judging the Booktube Prize? What do you think? I have picked up The Promise by Damon Galgut. I read this as an ebook, and I've actually finished it now, so it's only taken me a few days, and I was really surprised because, again, this isn't a book that I would have picked up. It's set in South Africa. It's about a family, and at the beginning the mother has died and she's made a promise. This is in apartheid times. She has got her husband to make a promise to, when she dies, to allow their maid to take ownership of the property she's living in. And this is a book all about whether that promise is kept. I was really pleasantly surprised by this. It has a lot of things going on with it that I don't like in books. So there's no speech punctuation, which always winds me up a bit. There has absolutely no text break. There's four chapters which are all really long, and the text in them is just continuous. There's no break in it at all. Yeah, events just go from one thing to another. I wouldn't normally like this, but I actually did find this story very intriguing, and I actually was interested in the characters and how it was going to turn out. And I also did think that the author had written it in an interesting way. Now, this book obviously won the Booker Prize this year. I don't often get on very well with reading prize-winning books, but I have to say I did enjoy this one. I'm not 100% sure what I would rate it if I was rating it. As you know, I don't put a huge amount of emphasis onto books being rated from 1 to 5. I was thinking maybe 3.5, but I am leaning towards giving this a 4. So it's come out a lot better than I thought it would. I really did enjoy it. And it was a quick read considering all of the things that I normally don't like in a book that were in it. So far so good. Really enjoyed reading The Promise, and it was a pleasant surprise because I didn't think that it would be a storyline I would be particularly interested in, and I found it very, very interesting. So I think I'm probably going to start The Prophets next because I'm feeling less drawn to it than I am to China Room. I think it might be a good idea to get it out of the way first because it's also the larger book. It's the one I'm not looking forward to very much out of these two, so I think I will crack on with this next in the hope of being surprised again. So I started reading The Prophets last week. Wow, I mean, I absolutely do not know what to say about The Prophets because for the first 100 pages I was absolutely forcing myself to read it, and I thought this is going to be a book that I am not going to enjoy. It's not the sort of thing I would ever think of picking up. Then after about 100 pages, I suppose I was starting to get into it a bit. By the time I hit 200 pages, I got to the point where I didn't want to put this down. It was just really amazing, and this book made me feel really devastated for what these people went through in this book, and for what so many people must have gone through in history. This is a book set on a plantation in the Deep South in America at the time of slavery, and it's a book about 2 slaves in love with each other who are Samuel and Isaiah, and they live in the barn together, and they have done since they were little boys, and Nobody on the farm really thinks that there's anything wrong with their relationship until one of the other slaves, Amos, decides to ask the plantation owner to let him learn about God and let him preach. So once he becomes a preacher, he starts to say that what Samuel and Isaiah are doing is wrong, and that the others on the farm shouldn't agree with them doing such a thing because it's against God, and so on. And I mean, this is a really, really powerful book. Like, if you can get through the first couple of 100 pages, it is very experimental and very sort of out there in my opinion. I've never read a book like this. Yeah, I came out of this book feeling like I should be reading books like this. I felt like this book had sort of expanded my thinking and expanded my desire to read about these sorts of issues. There's also like bits of history and an older storyline with a king of an African country who's actually a woman. And in that African country, you know, relationships of all kinds are absolutely fine, and that storyline was just desperately sad, and it was really horrific. It really made me think about like the evil things that human beings have done in the past. It's really, really hard to talk about this book, but by the 200th page I felt really, really invested in this. I really wanted to know what was going to happen. It was really suspenseful. I knew that something terrible was going to happen, and you could feel it coming for pages and pages, and you didn't know what it was going to be, and when it happened, it was awful. The ending to this is just absolutely devastating. I've heard people say about this book that the ending is difficult to understand, and yes, the ending is definitely open to interpretation, but I enjoyed the ending. I thought it was a suitable and good ending, and the way I interpreted it, it was emotional and it was really interesting the way the author had chosen to write this. I think this is a really well written book, and I'm amazed that it's a debut novel. Like, part of me thinks that it took too long to get into it. So if you're currently reading this book and you're struggling in the first 100 or so pages, I would say give it a bit longer. It's a really good book. I was not expecting to like this at all because it's completely out of my comfort zone of reading, but it was brilliant. There were characters that I really liked in this. I enjoyed reading about Maggie, I enjoyed reading about Isaiah, and lots of the other characters who you didn't necessarily like were incredibly interesting characters. So yeah, I thought this was an interesting and well told story, and I would definitely look for other books that dealt with similar issues in this, because this has taken me out of my comfort zone, but in a really, really good way. And I'm so glad that the Booktube Prize has made me read this, because I would never have picked it up otherwise, and I would have been missing out. So thank you, Booktube Prize, for making me read this one. I think I probably would slightly give this the edge over The Promise. There were things I did enjoy more about The Promise. Probably. The Promise was definitely more concise and clearer. You know, this is where this is experimental. The Promise is sort of straight down the line and quite bald about what it's saying, unless I've missed the point completely. There were a lot of things in this book that I liked more than The Promise, because this is laid out in fairly short chapters. It has chapter breaks, it has speech marks, it has things that I generally like about the structure of books. So this was a well-structured book too. I think at this moment in time, this one is in the lead above The Promise, just purely on gut feeling really. So we'll see how that goes over time. And I've now started China Room by Sunjeev Sahota. This is not a debut novel, and it's about Miha, who's a young bride in rural Punjab, and she's trying to work out the identity of her husband. So she lives with two other young women, and they've all got married to the three men of the household, but they don't know which of the men each of them is married to, so she's trying to find out. And that's as far as I've got with it so far. This has no elements of being difficult to read, so that's great. So it's been a couple of weeks since I last checked in. When I last checked in, I was reading China Room by Sunjeev Sahota, and I have now finished this book. I actually finished it probably the day after I last filmed. I was so surprised by this book. I really, really enjoyed it. It's completely not a book I would have picked up without the Booktube Prize. As I said, it's set in 1929 and it's set in rural Punjab, and it's all about a young woman, I think she's only actually 15, called Miha, and she is one of 3 girls who have been married to 3 brothers on the same farm in rural Punjab, and they don't actually know which of the 3 brothers each of them is married to. So this is mainly about Miha trying to find out which brother she is married to, because she's very curious about it, as she would be. There's also a bit about her childhood in here, and there's also a more modern storyline set in 1999, which is actually set later. It's set now. We hear from the guy who this is about, I don't think we get his name, later on in his life, and he is looking back on the events of 1999 when he went out to the same farm that Miha used to live on, and it turns out that Miha is his, I think she's his great grandmother, and yeah, it's just a really, really interesting story. I enjoyed the past timeline a lot more than I enjoyed the sort of 1999 timeline. That wasn't quite as interesting to me. But what made it all really, really interesting is something that you see at the end of this book. So I'm not going to spoil it for you because I wouldn't want to spoil it for anybody, but that just really made it extra special for me. And I thought this was a really good length of book. It kind of left me wanting a bit more. The course of Miha's story is far from smooth, and her storyline was so interesting, and this really was very, very gripping. And the writing of this is much more accessible than the other 2 books. The Promise was more inaccessible to me in that it didn't use speech punctuation, it didn't use really paragraphs, it didn't really use any breaks in the text, which are all things I don't like, but I actually did quite enjoy the storyline. The Prophets was easier to read in style terms, but much harder to read in terms of content. I think I probably like this one more overall because it was an easier read and it did flow a bit better, and I did understand this one all of the time, whereas in The Prophets there were bits that were a bit out there and a bit difficult to get to grips with. And as I said when I was reviewing The Prophets, I did find that there was at least sort of nearly half the book I was struggling with it, but it had such a second half that I almost still think it's maybe my favourite. But this one is just like quietly going along its story journey, really well written, and I can definitely see why it's on this prize list. And I would probably recommend this one more than I would recommend The Prophets, because The Prophets was so difficult to get into, and this one you're just into it straight away, and it's quite short. It's a very, very easy read, I would say. So probably at the moment this one is coming out top out of the 3 so far. Yeah, that has really surprised me. So the next book I'm reading is How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbue. I've read less than a third of this book so far, and it's really, really far out of my comfort zone, to be honest, but I have sort of turned the corner from not really enjoying it to enjoying it already, so we'll see how that one goes as well. Everything so far is surprising me, so it's really, really interesting to sort of be forced into reading books you would never read, and that's why I wanted to do the Booktube Prize, to get myself out of my comfort zone and see what there is out there in the world of literary fiction. And a lot of my books seem to have like quite a historical element, and I don't normally read much historical fiction at all, especially I don't normally read historical fiction set in other countries. So yeah, this is really broadening my horizons, and I will check in with you after I've finished How Beautiful We Were. So we are into the month of March, and last week, before February ended, I finished reading How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbue. This wasn't my favourite book that I've read for the Booktube Prize. I'm going to preface my review with the statement that this is the book in the prize group that is probably the furthest away from something that I would normally read. So I know a lot of people who really enjoy sort of multi-generational family sagas and historical fiction, which this kind of is. It's set in the 80s, but this was probably the book that was furthest out of my comfort zone, and probably the book that I would be least likely to have chosen to pick up on my own, although I don't think I probably would have picked up any of these on my own, but I'm glad I have. I'll start off by saying that I am actually really glad that I've read this book. I did find it quite difficult in places to get through. This is one of those books where I was able to see immediately that this is a book that a lot of people I know would absolutely love. It is a really, really well written book, and I can see exactly what the author was doing with the choices she's made, but it just wasn't for me. Like, I can admire this book without actually loving it myself, and that's how I feel about it, really, in a nutshell. So this is the story of a fictional African village called Kasawa. Basically, environmental degradation has been brought about by an American oil company, and oil spills and things have caused pollution and have caused children to die from toxic water. And the whole setup is very sad. You can easily see that this probably has happened in places in the world. The thing that sets this book apart and makes it different is that it's told through the eyes of a generation of children, and it's also told by members of the family of a girl called Thula, who is part of that generation. So the chapters alternated between being told by this generation of children, and what was interesting about that was it was told in the first person plural. So I don't think I've ever read a book before where the perspective is a we perspective. So for example, the first line is, "We should have known the end was near. How could we not have known?" And I thought that was a really interesting writing choice. And at times while reading that perspective, I found that perspective a little bit annoying because I wasn't used to it. At other times I thought it was really clever. Towards the end, I could see why it was important that the author had chosen to do this, and I think that's great. I really do admire what the author has done with this book, but I think it has both positives and negatives. So great for the progression of the storytelling, but I felt like I wasn't being given a specific person to care about. And for me, character is quite important to the level of care I have for a book. I did care about this generation, and it was terribly sad what was happening, and like awful to read about some of the things that were happening in this village. But really, it's almost the village that is the character. So I did care for the village, and I was deeply, deeply saddened by what happened to the village through the course of the book. I don't know, I think the cleverness of the book is in that style choice. In between times we do get a chapter told by Thula herself, who is part of that generation. We get chapters then interspersed that are also told by the children, even as they grow up into adulthood. And we do get perspectives from various people in Thula's family. So we get Thula's mother, her grandmother, her brother, her uncle. All of these people have their own chapters. I really enjoyed Thula's chapter at the beginning. I didn't really enjoy the perspective of many of the others, to be honest. The characters were super well drawn and they were all given very distinctive voices, but the things that they cared about were not necessarily things that I really desired to hear about. Like the mother's chapter, I think it was, she just kept going on about how much she basically enjoyed having sex with Thula's father, who from the beginning of this book is missing. Again, I can see why the author has chosen to make each character's voice distinct by giving you all the things that they care about. But also, one of the other things about the mother's chapter was it really pulled me out of the narrative, because in the chapter before, narrated by the children, it had like a really almost cliffhanger ending. The mother really doesn't reveal to you what has happened until pages and pages later, towards the end of her chapter. And I just found that a little bit frustrating sometimes. Like, when you got to really interesting points in the narrative, you sometimes weren't given the information quickly. And I do understand that delayed gratification and that, you know, that's suspense, but I didn't always enjoy the way the author used suspense in this. In summary, it is a really, really good book, but I can't put this in my list any higher than third at the moment. So I've read 4 books and this would come in third, I think. So at the moment, I definitely enjoyed this more than The Promise. I like the style choices made in this one more than I like the style choices made in The Promise, for certain. I do think this book has a great storyline. I found certain parts of it a little bit dull for my own personal tastes. I know a lot of people who, as soon as I'm allowed to talk about this, I'm going to be recommending this book to them, because I know that they will love it far more than I have. And I'm hugely grateful to the Booktube Prize that I have read this book, because I wouldn't have read it otherwise, and it was really interesting and I've been thinking about it since. The standard of the books in this category is so high that this is going to have to drop into third position. So at the moment, I like this less than China Room, definitely, which is still at the top for me. And I liked it less than The Prophets, because I found parts of both of those books difficult to read. But in The Prophets, I was given characters that I did really care about or was really, really interested in. And in this book, not so much. I cared about the village, but I didn't care super amounts about the characters, apart from maybe Thula, who is a great character in herself, but you're just not given a lot to latch onto with her, unfortunately. Also, I have actually finished my 5th book today. This is another amazing book, and this has started me thinking that there's going to be problems in rating these, because in theory, if you were the only one rating them, books 1, 2 and 3 would go through and books 4, 5 and 6 would not. So you're basically saying my 3 favourites are these 3. And I knew there would come a point where there could be a situation between 3rd and 4th place. And I think that this is a situation that may develop with this book. And the book it would be up against would be The Prophets. So this isn't my favourite book that I've read. My favourite is still China Room. But whether at the moment this would be in 2nd or 3rd place is really hard to say. I thought that this would be the book that would be closest probably to something that I would normally read, because there's a murder in it and it follows Mahmoud in the run-up to his trial for murder, which is a murder that he did not commit, as far as we know. I actually found this a lot harder to like than I thought, but it had a really, really impactful ending and I cried at the end of this. I thought it was really well done. Particularly towards the end, but it did take a lot of getting into, and as with How Beautiful We Were, there were just elements to this that didn't really grab me and that were not things I would normally read about, and that's great. I'm again glad I've read about them, but this is not a book, it's definitely not a book I would reread. But I do appreciate it as a really, really good book. This category is far better than I thought it was going to be when I started reading. Obviously, this is for a prize, so these are the best 48 books of the last year. And these are 6 of them, so I don't know why I expected any of them to be actually bad or unenjoyable. I didn't, but I just thought that there would be at least one book in here that I wouldn't enjoy at all, or that would be easy to rate bottom, but there hasn't been. I've enjoyed all of them in their own ways, but I was just a bit disappointed with how some parts of this book, for me, dragged a little bit. I would still recommend this book to people. I think that it's a wonderfully written book. I think Nadifa Mohamed is a very talented writer. And the characters she draws, particularly Mahmoud, Matan and his wife Laura were just wonderful. And she also portrayed the other side of the tragedy, the family of the person murdered, whose life ended up inextricably linked with Mahmoud Matan's life, because Mahmoud was falsely accused of her murder. But yeah, so this is set in the 50s in Cardiff's Tiger Bay. Mahmoud is from British Somaliland. The author does a really good job of showing the racial and cultural diversity in Tiger Bay in Cardiff in the 50s. You could quite honestly feel like you were there the way she wrote about this. It's a really well done piece of historical fiction. In the second half of this book, I really began to feel invested and sort of root for the main character. It's a really, really hard book to read. It's very hard-hitting. The ending was far more hard-hitting for me than the rest of the book. It's got a really powerful ending, and I feel the same way about The Prophets. Really powerful ending, difficult sometimes in the build-up. But which of the two would I pick and to be rated above the other? I think I'm going to have to give this one some time to sink in. Don't know what I'm going to do about The Prophets and The Fortune Men. Obviously, they may both be in the top 3 if I don't enjoy Cloud Cuckoo Land at all. But yeah, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard, this judging. I do like to judge a book on whether it stays with you as well. And although I wasn't particularly interested in this in the first part of the book, I did become attached to it. It's an interesting book for sure. It's a powerful book. I'll come back to you about the decision that I need to make. But before that, I do need to read Cloud Cuckoo Land. The day has finally come. I have finished my last Booktube Prize book. It is Monday the 21st of March, so I've finished with about a week to spare, and I've been reading this all morning. Don't know if it's the best time to record thoughts on it, but I wanted to, so yeah, I've just finished Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, which is the final book I needed to read for my judging. I think in the beginning part of this video, I told you that this was the book that I thought I would like to read the most out of all the books. I may have been wrong for the other books, but my prediction for this one was absolutely spot on, because this is not only the best book that I've read for the Booktube Prize by a long way, this is also, I think, probably the best book that I've read this year. It's taken me quite a few days to read this. It is a big chunky book of 600 plus pages, but it's very well organised, it's very well spaced. For example, we have whole pages that are literally just a title page and some blank pages, so it is by no means an arduous 600 pages. And just wow, I'm going to read you what it says about the book, because I don't want to spoil it and it'd be really hard not to, so I'll tell you what the book says about the book. From the Pulitzer Prize winning author of All the Light We Cannot See comes a triumph of imagination and compassion, a soaring story of resilience, hope, and a book. Bound together by a single ancient text, the unforgettable characters of Cloud Cuckoo Land are dreamers and outsiders figuring out the world around them. 13-year-old Anna and Omer, an orphaned seamstress and a cursed boy, on opposite sides of the formidable city walls during the 1453 siege of Constantinople. Teenage idealist Seymour and octogenarian Zeno in an attack on a public library in present-day Idaho, and Constance, decades from now, who turns to the oldest stories to guide her community in peril. Doerr has created a tapestry of times and places that reflects our own vast interconnectedness with other species, with each other, with those that lived before us and those who will be here after we're gone. Dedicated to the librarians then, now and in the years to come, Cloud Cuckoo Land is a beautiful and redemptive novel about stewardship of the book, of the earth, of the human heart. And I think that's a really, really good blurb. So it goes between these sort of 3 time frames, and within those 3 time frames we have the points of view of Anna separately and Omer separately, and we also have separate points of view of Zeno, who is the octogenarian that was mentioned in the blurb. and Seymour, who's a teenager, and also the perspective of Constance many years in the future. So this is a really powerful book, and I've been sitting reading the last 100 to 200 pages of this morning, crying, and just the way it all came together was amazing. I love a book that is about libraries and is about books and is about the power of reading and the power of books being passed down through centuries, and the connections in this book are just amazing. I can see that this would be a book that not everybody would like, but I can also see how this would find its way onto a prize list. This does deserve to win the Booktube Prize, in my opinion. I would probably go so far as to give this 5 stars, and I don't really give books 5 stars. It's a measure of how much I like this book that I already want to buy myself a copy so that I can reread this at some point in the future. And I didn't really feel that way about any of the other books. Yeah, it was a powerful story, and I love the thread running through this as well of the ancient text that's mentioned. So at the beginning of every chapter we have a supposed folio of a lost book called Cloud Cuckoo Land by Antonius Diogenes. There are some notes in the back about the reality of whether this lost book is a real lost book. It begins with the words, "Stranger, whoever you are, open this to learn what will amaze you." And this book did amaze me. I loved it. There were a couple of times when I thought the story in Constantinople was maybe a tiny bit too slow, but there was no point in this book where I felt disengaged from it or felt bored with it. It's an absolutely stunning book. I loved the characters in this. I would say this is well worth a read, especially if you like books that span time and books that talk about books. And also, I don't know if I would have enjoyed this as much if I hadn't have had a bit of a Greek phase earlier in the year and last year and had read the Iliad and the Odyssey. Not because those books are definitely in it, but because of the Greek connections in this, and that runs really throughout the book. I think that having read those two really did play into my enjoyment of this. I see Harry's joined me for the video as well. I didn't realise he could go up on that bit. But yeah, Cloud Cuckoo Land, I'm definitely going to be rating this top of my list. By far my favourite. Like, it stands head and shoulders above the other books. For me personally, yeah, I hope lots of people will go out and read this book, and I highly, highly recommend it. If you've read this book, please do let me know in the comments. We can talk about it. I was just amazed by it. I think this is absolutely brilliant, and I feel a little bit about this book the way I feel about The Book Thief, in that it explores literacy and what a book can do for various different people in various different times, and I absolutely love that thread running through it. I can't rate that bit highly enough. So a brilliantly put together book. This is absolutely fantastic. So at this point I've decided to split my final rankings into a separate video, because otherwise this one's going to be way too long. Thank you for watching my reviews of each of the books as I went along. If you've come from that video, thanks for watching both. If you are off to see that now, I'll link it somewhere. Please do give this video a like if you enjoyed it. Please do comment down below and let me know what you thought of these books if you have read them. And I'd love for you to stick around, so please do subscribe. Hope to see you all for my final rankings in the next video. Bye for now.